Daniel Ricciardo's F1 career is hanging by a thread as his all-or-nothing Red Bull situation heads rapidly towards nothing. Ricciardo's been facing a weird crossroads for a while. It's been clear for a few months that he'd either be getting a Red Bull racing seat or he'd probably be out of F1 altogether. And it might be even worse than that, because now Ricciardo's not only set to lose his RB seat to Liam Lawson for 2025, he looks and sounds like he will not even see out the current season. Red Bull's approaching a contractual deadline to give its young driver Lawson a race seat in one of its teams for next year. It needs to guarantee that by the end of September, or Lawson is a free agent, not that there's anywhere obvious for him to go. Ricciardo's future was therefore subject to a lot of speculation during the Singapore Grand Prix weekend, and he actually went into it knowing that at some point after the event, he would find out if he had a drive in 2025 or not. So Red Bull making a decision in the coming 4-week gap in the schedule is guaranteed, and Ricciardo was initially adamant that as far as he was aware it was all about next year. But there were strong claims before and during the Singapore event that the decision would actually be about whether this was Ricciardo's last race and Lawson should step in from the next one in Austin. And nobody at Red Bull Racing or RB made much effort to dampen that speculation. Red Bull Chiefs Christian Horner and Helmut Marko and Ricciardo's immediate team boss Laurent Mekies all had ample opportunities to categorically state that Ricciardo won't be dropped after this race, and they opted not to do so. In fact, they almost did the opposite, leaving the door wide open to exactly that happening. And by the end of the weekend, Ricciardo admitted it was not just being considered, it was a realistic possibility. He cut a visibly emotional figure after a difficult race that he spent at the back and ended with a consolation run for fastest lap that also helped the senior Red Bull team take a point off championship rival Lando Norris. Ricciardo's TV interviews were conducted with lots of long pauses, breaks in his voice, and a hint of tears in his eyes, as Ricciardo admitted he was feeling a flood of emotions and feelings and added, "I'm aware this could be it." Ricciardo has been underwhelming this year against his own expectations and his employers, and it's fair to say that Red Bull's gambit with him has failed. Ricciardo was brought in as a third driver for 2023 after 2 increasingly tough years at McLaren ended with him being paid to sit on the sidelines. Ricciardo's job was to be a Red Bull Racing backup should Sergio Perez continue to struggle, and he had that dream return in mind when the opportunity arose mid-2023 to get back on the grid at the second Red Bull team, where Ricciardo thought he could prove he could still operate at the front in F1. But unfortunately, Ricciardo's been just fine and nothing more. He's admitted he's come up short, and even if he doesn't get dropped by RB, he's questioning what the point is in continuing in F1 if there's no Red Bull Racing future for him. The occasional impressive peak and the occasional anonymous weekend have pretty much cancelled each other out, leaving behind a string of slightly inconsistent performances and slightly disappointing results. That's not been drastically different to teammate Yuki Tsunoda though, given RB's competitiveness has dipped in the midfield and its development has been patchy at best. And although Singapore qualifying was a return to the kind of early season nose-bloodying result against Tsunoda that Ricciardo had pretty much banished, it would be harsh to suggest that his form has been so poor he needs to be dropped right now. Ricciardo had been in better form than Tsunoda before the summer break after recovering from a difficult start to the year, although in the 4 races since the season resumed his performances have been mixed and he trails Tsunoda 12-6 overall in qualifying. He and Tsunoda have tended to trade weekends in which one is faster in qualifying or finishes ahead, but both have been hamstrung by the RB team running into development setbacks and becoming less competitive in the midfield. Ricciardo's consistently admitted he's not made a compelling case for himself over the whole season, but he has been happier with his overall performance trend since June. The real blow is that given how uncertain Red Bull's been about what to do with its drivers, he could conceivably have altered his fate with a mega run in Singapore. Red Bull's intentions for its drivers have fluctuated through the year in an unusually volatile situation. Just think back to the final race before the summer break when it looked like Red Bull really might axe Perez and Ricciardo was flirting with the mid-2024 Red Bull Racing promotion. Ricciardo admitted it's basically turned into a race-by-race evaluation, and this one went badly against him, having looked promising to start with. He and RB were very competitive on Friday, but then Ricciardo was eliminated in Q1, which inevitably set him up for a long, difficult Grand Prix. It was the worst possible on-track response to the speculation, which is a surprise given Ricciardo has tended to do his best work when his back's been up against the wall, and meant any slim chance Ricciardo had of wresting back control of his destiny was eliminated. Given what we've just said about his 2024 performances, we're not going to pretend Ricciardo's made a stunning case, especially as Red Bull needs to prepare for the future. But there's a difference between not continuing with him in 2025 and not letting him even finish this season. Ousting Ricciardo for Lawson next year makes a lot of sense. It's basically Red Bull saying thanks for the effort DR and the high points, but you're 35 and you're not the future anymore. But why not let Ricciardo see out 2024? He'll likely perform just fine against Tsunoda, probably score more points if the car's any good, and can help get 6th in the Constructors' Championship over the line. Usually when a driver gets dropped mid-season it's harsh, but there is a good performance reason underlining it. That was why Williams finally lost patience with the underperforming Logan Sargent this year, and it's how Ricciardo got back on the grid in 2023 himself, as Nick de Vries was having an awful rookie season. RB is clinging on to 6th in the Constructors, and Singapore qualifying is the first time in months that Ricciardo's missed an obvious opportunity to perform better. But he did a decent job on Sunday, and this is simply not a Sargent-esque situation where the team finally had to give up on a driver nowhere near the level required. There is no reason to think Lawson would come in and be an immediate major upgrade, and it's still a tricky situation to drop him in the middle of. If Ricciardo's time is up at the end of the year and Lawson's the future, then there is some merit in cracking on with the change now. It's also a good time to do it, as Lawson can have a whole month to prepare before he gets in the car on a race weekend. But this isn't overtly performance-based for the RB team. It's about a bigger Red Bull picture and relates to the wider uncertainty and confusion that has undermined its driver choices in recent years. It's believed that Red Bull sees this as a way to evaluate Lawson for more than an RB seat in 2025, like replacing Perez at Red Bull Racing. Why else would Red Bull need to see how good Lawson is when he did a strong job and scored points standing in for Ricciardo for a few races last year? There is nothing Red Bull needs to learn about Lawson's candidacy for a 2025 RB seat, so there has to be more afoot, and the self-inflicted drama Red Bull's in across both its teams is baffling for an organisation of such quality. The questions it's facing right now are plenty. What to do with Perez? What to do with Ricciardo? Which seat should Lawson take? Is there anyone actually good enough to drive for the senior team? So there's a semblance of logic to Lawson coming in now, and Ricciardo clearly cottoned on to the reality in Singapore, so at least had some kind of chance to savour the moment. But Red Bull's uncertainty ultimately left Ricciardo exposed to a weekend of awkward questions, put a cloud over him, and potentially let him run his last race without him knowing it for sure. Someone of his stature and pretty reasonable performance level probably deserves more than such a sad farewell and the embarrassment of being kicked out before the season even ends. Losing his RB seat would likely mean Ricciardo's only real chance of staying in F1 isn't taking Perez's place at Red Bull Racing, it's maybe reclaiming his RB seat if Lawson gets the Red Bull Racing nod for 2025. Perez's own place is looking more secure for the rest of 2024 after increasingly encouraging weekends since the summer reset, despite Red Bull's own form deteriorating and Perez having his own stinker in Singapore. Red Bull's admitted that it's traced its development missteps all the way back to an upgrade that Perez first questioned back in the first half of 2023, with Perez performing better against Max Verstappen and flat out beating him in Baku, and Red Bull seemingly finally adjusting its car to address an issue Perez has been vocal about for some time. It seems like he's sorted for the rest of this season. We can't go as far as saying Red Bull will keep Perez for 2025 though, and if that doesn't happen, it's more likely that Lawson would step in if he has a great end of season cameo at RB. That might give Ricciardo a route back into the second team next season if Lawson ends up at Red Bull and Perez is off the grid entirely, but a lot needs to happen for that to materialise. Ricciardo could just be kept in the Red Bull family under contract for the rest of this year and maybe 2025 too, and just hang around waiting. He hasn't had talks with other teams, nor have they shown any interest in him. There is only one other vacancy at Audi-owned Sauber, but that team is looking at re-signing incumbent Valtteri Bottas or maybe replacing him with a young driver. But whether it's an RB reprieve or seeing whether an unlikely door does open elsewhere, all Ricciardo would be doing is prolonging his midfield frustrations. That doesn't sound like it appeals anymore, given his own comments about what purpose prolonging his time in F1 would serve without a Red Bull Racing future. He's also questioned whether at 35 he's actually capable of consistently matching the level of younger drivers week in, week out. It might be time for Ricciardo to start plotting another course, although he says that so far he's not given much consideration to finding a drive somewhere else. Ricciardo's joked he's still scared of IndyCar, and more seriously, having raced at the very front in F1, he isn't sure he'd get the same thrill from going to another discipline that he can't guarantee he'd be awesome in. He said at the start of the Singapore weekend he'd think more about his alternatives when he's no longer in F1, and that might be coming sooner than he'd imagined.